What is the creepiest experience that has ever happened to you or somebody else? Serious, NSFW. Went camping with some friends on hill a few kilometers out in the woods from one of the guys' house. There's a few hiking four-wheeling trails in the area that lead up to the hill, so it's known by the locals. It was about midnight, we had a fire going and were just sitting around having a good time. Then the guy, there was 4 of us, sitting opposite of me, yells, "Who are you?" I turn around and there's this man, about 6 feet tall, staring at us from the edge of the woods with a big rock in his hand. One guy knocked an arrow in the compound bow we had. The guy across from me grabbed the hatchet and I pulled the knife off my belt. We had no clue what we were doing, but the guy wouldn't say anything to us. He eventually just backed into the woods. No sleep was had that night and we kept a very large fire going. No one ever believes me when I tell this story, but here goes. So it was my 3rd year in college and I was roommates with a friend I had known from high school. The guy was a little odd. Didn't make friends easily. Made lists constantly. Played video games obsessively, sometimes for 18 hours straight, and talked in his sleep. But he was a fun guy to have around to keep things interesting. So one night I was asleep and dreaming that he and I were on a huge pile of trash looking for something. I woke up and took a leak. When I walked back into the room, he rolled over in bed, still asleep, and said, "I found it. It's over here." Then thrashed and went back to sleep. The next morning he had no memory of it and I know I was awake. I think he was in my mind. When I was 4, I had an ongoing obsession with Silly the cat. My family didn't have a cat, especially not a Siamese. It was purely in my imagination. I drew pictures of Silly, talked to Silly, dreamed of Silly, made a space on my pillow for Silly to sleep on, had empty food dishes on the floor for Silly, and drove everybody f***ing mad with Silly. One day we went to a theme park sort of place, and for hours straight my parents had to listen to my talk about Silly. How Silly was waiting in a box for me to come get her so we could go home. This is the bit my mum loves to tell. On the way home, my dad cracked. Constant pressure about a make-believe cat. Poor guy had had enough. He began whacking his hand on the steering wheel and yelling, "You want a cat? We'll get a cat. Goddamn." And drove to the shelter on the outskirts of town. So we go into the cat room, and without pause I head straight to a cage in the middle of the row. Point and say, "Yup. There's Silly." There in the cage was a Siamese cat named Cicely, who stayed with us for 16 years. My dad built a little wooden shrine in the flower garden when she passed, and didn't stop moping for months. I had a friend of 8 years who one summer afternoon admitted to me that he works for the CIA. Now, he was 18 at the time and I believed him at first, although in the back of my mind, I thought it sounded a bit strange. Every single time he came back to see me, he always talked about it, and every time, I believed him less and less until he was absolutely delusional. Before I ended up not believing him, he told me that he killed people late at night and buried them around the deserts of Las Vegas. Every night he would go down to the CIA and have these assignments to find people to torture people. He had a collection of knives in his room that he used. Once he sent me a picture of what the CIA looked like inside, but I found the same picture on Google Images. Then things got weirder. He would sometimes spy on me and my friends right outside of our houses without saying anything until we found out the next time we saw him. He takes this liquid called B180 to make himself stronger when facing people to kill. He stays awake most of the night, not tired at all because he has a lot to think about. The last time I saw him, he told me that he has a problem, but he never told me what was wrong with him. I was once upon a time a wireless engineer for a very big telecom. We worked in facility in Long Island, pretty deep underground. Enough that there is no cell phone coverage. At 1:17 PM exactly, the 50 or so phones we had for testing all rebooted at the same moment. They came back up and started cycling. Over 3 hours we scrambled to find a pattern of some sort. We tried a different network, different FIMOTSL, different phones. No one could come up with an explanation or even a pattern to what caused a particular phone to reboot once every 5 minutes and another to reboot every 45 seconds. At about 430 my boss tells us to clear out. Just come back tomorrow to see what we could do. I get to the Long Island Railroad station and it's a completely clear day, but every train is shown as delayed. I kinda remembered that they were using something involving cell phones for the trains. Speak to the conductor and he confirms that something is up with the computers today. Notice quite a few phones reboot on the train. The next day everything was fine. We never could explain it. Now, I sit here and read about how civilian drones are using cell phone stations and worry. Was walking down my street at night. My street is on the outskirts of town and is in a heavily wooded area. It's really like space vacuum quiet. No wind. So I'm walking and the only light is that which is given off by the light pollution in town, so it's dark AF. I start to hear this heavy panting. WTF I think, and my heart starts to race and I get chills. I look behind and about 30 feet away. The farthest I can see in the dark is a squat black silhouette. I'm f-king freaking the hell out now and start to run. The silhouette is bounding closer and fast. I dip into the woods and stop behind a dead bush hoping this shitty doesn't see me. A few seconds later, a huge black dog comes galloping up drooling and starts to growl low. I walk up to the dog and start to act real dominant. I tower over it and yell, "Hey, go home." He squeals a bit and sits down, panting still. I approach the dog and firmly pet him. He turns out to be a big sweetie and I go back to the road to finish my joint. When I was a kid my grandparents lived in a split level house. I used to spend the night there a lot. One time, when I was about 12, I was spending the night. It was late and my grandpa was working and my grandma had to run to the store. I was there alone, laying on the couch downstairs near the base of the stairs. It was summer. Kind of a nice night and grandma left the front door open with just the screen door closed. After I heard her pull down the driveway, I hear someone walk up the porch steps, across the porch, open the screen door and then run upstairs. The footsteps then ran back down the stairs, stopping for a moment at the landing and then racing down the steps to the family room. I lifted my head expecting to see a family member, but there was nobody. The stairs ended 3 feet from my head and there should have been someone there. But no. I freaked, covered my head with the blanket and stayed like that until grandma got home. My mother stopped talking with her father for about 8 years because of previous conflicts. My mother said while she was dreaming, she heard a clear voice tell her to call her father. My mother said she awoken shortly after and had a horrible feeling. She was able to obtain his phone number through other siblings. Turns out he was in a car crash and on life support. He recovered and they were able to rebuild their relationship. I've told this story before on another account and it was pretty high up in the thread, so it might sound familiar to some people. I was a teenager at the time and laying on the couch one night watching TV. Everyone else was already asleep. Our living room had a big window right behind the TV which looked out to the patio. As I was laying there I suddenly caught, out of the corner of my eye, a man's face pressed right up against the window staring at me with this wide-eyed, crazy expression. I held my panic down surprisingly well and just sort of calmly got up and walked to my brother's room and got him to look outside to see if anybody was there. And of course there wasn't. In the morning I went out to the patio to see if there were, I dunno, footprints or something. I immediately noticed that the patio table was shoved up against the wall below the window, and there were nose and forehead prints on the glass. For someone to be in the position to make those prints, he would have had to be on top of the table on his hands and knees, with his face pressed against the glass looking at me the night before. Drugs, I assume. When I was a kid, about 6 years old, I had a dream about walking through a house I'd never been in before. It was a fairly normal and boring dream. I simply walked from room to room and looked at stuff. Anyway, flash forward to a few months later and our family moves halfway across the country into a new house. On the day we walk in, I immediately recognize it from my dream. It was the exact same house that I had dreamt about months earlier. I told my parents and they essentially laughed it off, thinking that I was telling a joke. To this day, it's something that I haven't forgotten about. I have no explanation and more importantly no proof, since it was originally all just a dream. But I still swear by the story until this day. I was camping with my family one time. We had a large tent that could fit our entire family in it, 6. I awoke one night to the sound of what sounded to be squealing in the distances. I began to freak out, thinking something was outside the tent. I waited for a while until it began getting louder. Then the smell came. It was at that moment that I realized someone had let out a very long and very odorous fart. I know this sounds like a joke, and I have noted the serious tag. But it was very scary for an 8-year-old kid to hear what sounded like screaming in the woods. Edit. Wow, this blew up. Biggest comment post yet. Thanks Edit. Thanks kind stranger for the gold. I've posted this story before, but it's definitely up there as one of the creepiest things that's happened to me, so I'll share again here. I was f***ing my girlfriend in the backseat of her car out in an abandoned construction site when a white mid-90s Ford Taurus showed up. Car pulled up behind us, put on the high brights, and sat there idling. I put on my underwear and got into the front seat and then just drove. The f***ing car followed us for a good 15 minutes. Finally I found a cop parked for a traffic trap and I just pulled up behind him and parked. The Taurus left, and the cop never bothered to get out of the car to see what was up. Fortunately, neither my girlfriend or I got raped. It was a good night. One of my good friends noticed over the course of a few months that a lot of her bras and underwear had gone missing. Like much more than anyone would expect to just misplace. It continued on for another 6 months or so when she and her husband finally decided to change the locks on their doors. She never had a pair go missing after that. This happened to my brother's GF. They eventually changed the locks too, and it stopped. They still don't know who it was, but my brother said that if he had to guess, he'd say it's that weirdo who lives on the 2nd floor. I mean, he used to go fishing once a week in his boat, still on the trailer, in the parking lot. When I was in 1st grade I was playing with a bunch of friends in the woods near their house. There was a hill on one side that ended in the backyards of some other houses. All of a sudden we noticed a man in a Santa Claus outfit just standing at the top of the hill, staring at us. This was particularly odd because it was the middle of summer. We all stared at each other for a minute before he let out a battle cry and came running full speed down the hill at us. We booked it back to my friend's house and ran inside and locked the doors. No idea what happened to Santa. The doorbell rang late at night, around 1 while I was watching TV. I went upstairs and looked out the window on the side of the door. Nobody was there. It rang again. I was freaked out and waited a bit. Then stretched up and looked through a window at the top of the door and there was someone pressed up against the door, huddled in the corner. I freaked and stood still for a minute. I looked up again and I saw a hooded person running away from the house down the street. Doesn't sound like a ding dong ditch to me. Sounds like a strong arm home invasion. Soon as the door starts to open you'd have been rushed. We were on a foot patrol through a very hostile town in Afghanistan called Shark. We had been in contact with the enemy for a better part of 5 days by this point. Anyways, as we were walking through the market it was completely empty, which was very weird. All of the Afghan National Army guys were looking very worried. I was looking around and there were meat hangers with chunks of meat swinging in the breeze and flies buzzing around them. You could hear the chains rattle and it was very eerie. As we're walking the nighttime call to prayer begins. I swear it felt like I was in a Middle Eastern Western movie right before a showdown. Once the call to prayer started the Allah began panicking and looking all over the place. Apparently the Taliban had planned to launch an ambush on us that was signaled by the call to prayer. We were in some very narrow streets with multi-level buildings on all sides. All I could hear were the chains rattling, the flies buzzing and the call to prayer. We just kept on walking, waiting for the ambush. But it did not come. This was by far the most creepy moment of my life. Edit. Thanks for the gold. When my parents lived at their first house as newlyweds and were building the house we live in now, my dad tells a story of how a voice saved their life. They were sound asleep one night and my dad hears a voice calmly saying, "Go check the boiler. It's not right." He gets up, goes to the basement, and sure enough, the boiler was about to catch on fire and would have caused the house to burn down. Now at the house we live in, my dad and I both see people walking across our porch and people walking upstairs. A few years ago I heard a voice tell me to go and check our heater. It wasn't right, a small electric space heater we use when the temps get below zero or in the 1s. Sure enough, the tablecloth had slid off the table just enough to be near the heater and had started to smoke when I found it. When I was like 12 I would spend my summer evenings outside, cycling with my friends. My apartment building used to be really creepy, built in the Soviet times as well. And one evening I headed home later than usual. It was almost night. Rushed home so my mum wouldn't kill me. When the elevator opens up and about 40-50 YO men are revealed inside. One of them was holding a massive dirty bag, which had a few bloody stains. The guy himself was huge. Had a deformed face with scars and head with almost a Frankenstein shape and eyes as cold as I've ever seen. His companion was almost half of his height. Dressed in baggy, dirty clothes. Looked much less intimidating. All three of us froze. I couldn't take my eyes off the big guy. After a good 10 seconds of staring he leaves the elevator, extends his hand, which was the size of my tiny head, and starts walking towards me. I was scared shitless. Heart pounding. Didn't have a clue how to react to this. When the shorter guy just says, "Don't bother. We have enough." The big guy doesn't say anything and they both walk away. Never came home late after that. I really wish I could make stuff like this up. But then again, it's Eastern Europe. A little late to the thread but I tell this story pretty often. When I was in Iraq we were on patrol one night and stopped at an intersection pulling perimeter support for another unit who had requested assistance in our area. The mission went off without a hitch and it was honestly a little boring just waiting around. Then it got quiet. I mean really quiet. This was in Baghdad. The city is never really quiet, even at night. But it was as if all the sound was sucked out of the area. Suddenly the entire block lost power and it was very dark. Within seconds of the power going out, close to what I can only guess was at least 50 dogs flooded the street from an alleyway and ran around our Humvees. They didn't bark, just growled as they ran. As soon as they ran into another alley and out of sight the power came back on and all the normal city noise returned. It was incredibly unnerving. Like a horde of demons had just ran past us in the form of dogs. This happened about 13 years ago. It was October or November and there were no leaves left on the trees around our neighborhood. I was in elementary school and my brother, 6 years elder, had just got a new camera to take with him on a trip to Europe with People to People. That night he and I walked down the block to a convenience store to grab a drink. On the way back we noticed one of the neighbor's trees looked like it had a ton leaves and was rustling despite it being a windless evening. Once we returned home we grabbed that new camera to use the flash to see the tree better, because we couldn't find any bright lights, and walked back to that tree. We stood across the street from it and listened to the rustling for a moment before my brother raised the viewfinder to his eye and snapped a picture with the flash on. At the instant the flash went off all I saw was what seemed like 1,000 glowing red eyes staring right at us. Then a horrid amount of squeaking and flapping of wings. We ran back to the house as fast as we could while whatever was in the tree swooped at us. We ended up sporting a few scrapes. A few minutes later we ventured back out to find the ground where we had stood was covered in bird dropping and a few feathers. Evidently that tree was full of a murder of crows. I got to ask my brother about that picture tomorrow. My fiance and I were leaving our friend's house at close to midnight. This was in a nice neighborhood but I got a sudden feeling that something was majorly wrong. Just as we were putting our stuff into my car I hear a car engine start up the street a ways. I tell my fiance to hurry up and get in, trusting my instincts. At that moment a pickup truck peels out and speeds towards us, cutting off my car from the front. This was in a cul-de-sac. We could see the face of someone deranged. I wasted no time slamming my car into reverse and backing towards the exit, then flipping around and trying to drive off. He raced and partially blocked the exit, but I managed to get through. We raced through several residential streets as he tried to shove us off the road and corner us. We finally got away after getting to a main road and going 115 miles per hour towards the police station while my fiance was frantically trying to get the police to us. We found out later that the guy was a local meth head with a sizable rap sheet whose girlfriend lived next door. Apparently my fiance looked a little like her and he thought I was picking up his girlfriend. This experience caused us to get our concealed carry permits. 10/10 thrill ride though, would do again. TLDR, got chased in my car by a local meth head that thought I was stealing his girlfriend. One night I was out with some friends, running around neighborhoods doing stupid shit like moving yard gnomes and whatever. Well, for some reason, me and a friend ran away from another friend to ditch him in the middle of the street. It was a joke and we were just laughing about it and running, not saying anything else at all. We ran into someone's backyard and I stopped right next to a bush. And I'm just losing it, laughing hysterically. I look down at the bush I'm next to and it was actually some dude crouched down in someone's backyard, staring up at me. He lost his shit and ran for his life. And I didn't realize what had happened until my brain processed why the FCK a bush ran away from me. So kinda creepy on my part that I found some guy scoping out a home. Also hilarious to think I was a demon child bringing judgment day upon the wicked. That man must have found Jesus after that. I was younger when this happened, around 6th grade or so. I lived with my aunt in Mt. Shasta, California. I would ride my bike down a street until it ended by some railroad tracks that was surrounded, and on the other side of the tracks was where the local pizza joint kid hangout place. I've traveled that path plenty of times and never had problems, but one day I felt off about going that way but decided to go since I had friends waiting. As I get to the tracks and step off my bike, a middle-aged guy steps out from behind a tree and starts walking toward me. I wanted to run but I was too scared and just stood there frozen. He walked up and started asking where I was headed and I managed to tell him I was going to see my friends. He looks over his shoulder in the direction of where I was headed and just looks back at me and asks, "Don't be afraid of me." Boy, I thought I was done for. But just as he put a shoulder on me, someone yelled from behind me to get away from me. I looked back to see a guy stepping out of his car at the end of the road and walking toward us. The older guy just turned and started running along the tracks towards more trees. The guy in the car made sure I was alright and walked my back to the road and told me to never go there again. When I was 5 years old, a knock came to the door. Since I lived in the country, I really didn't think much fear about strangers. I opened the door and a tall man in glasses and beard entered my home and said to me, "Hey little guy, want to come help me find my dog?" He proceeded to grab my hand. While all this was going on, my mom was downstairs doing laundry. She heard a voice and came up the stairs screaming and yelling for me. I turned around to look at her with Winchester shotgun in hand, and when I turned around, the man was gone. Door was shut and no one running away from the home. I was almost kidnapped. Shit. I feel like I'm late to the party and mine doesn't stack up to the rest of these here, but I wanna share anyways. I was at work late one night. Closing shift and the store was fairly empty. I'm at the fitting rooms, which is in the back of the store, when a guy comes in and asks for a favor. Him. "I need you to come out to my car and find out my girlfriend's size so I can buy something for her." Me. Not really thinking he actually asked me to leave the building. "I can help you find something. Do you know her size?" Him. No. But she's in the car if you can come out and find out." Me. Okay. So I'm not actually allowed to leave the building. But if you can go out and find out her size, I'd be happy to help you find something. Him. "You can't come out to my car?" Me. No. He eventually settled on address and paid quickly and left, but the whole experience left me in a full-blown panic attack. From the first time he asked me to come out to his car to I had that sick feeling in my stomach that something was wrong. I still wonder why he was trying to lure me out to his car and what would have happened if he was successful in doing it. I know that it doesn't fall under the conventionally creepy theme this thread has going, but it is the thing that has unnerved me the most in my current memory. I gained a few hours one day. I live in the country, so my garbage needs to be taken to a dump. They open at 1:30 on Wednesdays. That's my day off, so I figured I'd take the trash. I waited to leave until around 1:45. I got there, dumped the garbage, had my usual talk with the guy working, and left. I started driving away and my clock said 11 something. I pulled over to freak out a bit. Maybe I read the clock wrong? Maybe I thought it was 1 but it was 10. So I turn around, I was on the same road, and go to the dump. It's closed. I know I was in there and dumped the garbage. I know the guy didn't leave and lock up, he's left before and leaves it open. I don't know how I gained a few hours. New Year's 2013. I was visiting some friends who were still in college. I had just graduated. We were walking back from the bar around 3 AM and I see a girl who can barely walk being dragged up a hill by a guy who was clearly a lot more coherent than she was. We just stopped and stared for a minute and something just didn't sit right with us. She kept saying no. He kept getting more aggressive. So we came up with a plan. At once, I lunge at the guy and take him down. My buddy catches the drunk girl who immediately hits the deck. And our third buddy calls the cops. While we waited for the cops to come, I started asking the guy what he was doing, to which he replied by calling me a nosy cockblock. Meanwhile, the girl kept asking us what part of Baltimore we were in. We were in College Park, which is about 40 minutes from Baltimore. Long story short, the girl was put in an ambulance with a 22 back and the dude was arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping. We helped put him away for a few years. I'll always act when I see something fishy after that incident. When I was about 10 years old, my little brother and I were playing in a local park when all of a sudden, a car appeared in the parking lot and parked close to where we were playing. I noticed they'd been there for about 5-10 minutes. So I stopped and looked over. The people started opening the car doors. And something told me to grab my brother and run back to where my parents were, in a gymnasium the next street over. As we were running, they got back in the car and followed us at our speed, slow for a car, until we went through some trees in the back entrance of the gym. I told my parents and I shit you not. 5 minutes later some police officers came into the gym asking if anyone had seen the vehicle that had just stalked my brother and me. We almost got kidnapped that day. A friend of mine lost his father in high school. His parents were divorced and his mom remarried to his stepdad and he lived in their home. Sometime after his father's death he began experiencing sleep paralysis and hypnagogic episodes where he would wake up and see his father standing at the foot of his bed. He said that all of the episodes were the same and his father would disappear after around 30 seconds. He experienced this for nearly a month straight. One night he woke up and rather than seeing his father disappear he watched him walk through one of his walls. The next morning his mother had been murdered by his stepfather. Edit. People asked why he killed her. Apparently she had been cheating on her husband, stepfather, with her ex-husband. Another creepy moment. Flashback to me. 3 years old. Riding in the car with my mom. I point out a 1967 Corvette Stingray and start talking about how I used to have a car like that. My mom decides to play along and ask me questions about the car. Conversation continues for a bit and finally ends in an awkward silence with this statement. Before I was here. Before I was your son. I had a car like that and I drove it off a bridge. Double quote. Flash forward 13-14 years. I have no recollection of the previous series of events. But I'm at the age of learning to drive and thinking about my first car. I mention in passing how my dream car would be a 1967 Corvette Stingray. My mother's response was a very emphatic. Absolutely not. No way in hell. I forbid you from ever owning that car. And she proceeded to tell me about the conversation she had with me years ago. My father told my family this story a few years ago and refuses to talk further about it since. So my dad recently got out of the army. The Vietnam War ended and he never shipped out. He's driving eastbound late one night on some fuck-all interstate, can't remember which one. And he's the only car for miles around. Suddenly out of nowhere a semi, a timed DC speeds from behind him, pulls around his left side and merges in front of him, with 4 black trucks in tow. This was back when civilian band, CB, radios were still in wide usage. So my dad gets on his CB tune to channel 19. Pretty much the B of CB radio channels, in terms of it was used for idle chit-chatting, and hails the semi once. How about that time DC truck? What are ya haulin' and where to? Normally the trucker would respond to this question with an appropriate answer. It's not unusual to get asked what you're hauling if you're the second only truck out at fuck all hours of the night. Anyway, dad hails the truck once. Yeah. No answer. Hails twice. No answer. Hails third time and midway gets cut off by some creepy voice modulator affected speaker saying something along the lines of "you leave that time DC truck alone. Remember how there were black trucks escorting that semi? Yeah, that was them." Needless to say, this spooked my dad pretty good and he shut up for the rest of the night and let them go about their business. Junior year at college, my friend was staying over before he went abroad. After going out, he fell asleep on the couch and I went up to my room. At around 3:30 am I wake up with a really weird feeling. And when I turn over, my friend is standing there just staring. I ask him what he was doing. And he kind of snaps out of a trance and says, "I'm getting in bed with you." I tell him, "No you are not," and he says, "No, don't worry, I'm just getting in bed." So I sit up, put my hand on his shoulder and say, "No, I'm sorry, but you can't sleep in my bed." He got really serious and looked me straight in the eye and says, "No, you're f***ing not," then went back to the couch. I tried to go back to sleep but I was terrified and after about 15 minutes I locked my door because I was scared. The next day I bring it up and he has no recollection of it. But he says now my texts make sense. He texted our mutual friend saying how pissed off he was and how he wanted to kill me. But I'm still alive and we're still friends. When I was 12, I was on an overnight train in India with my parents and brother. I had an upper bunk bed and my dad slept on the lower bunk. My brother and mom were in different compartments. In the middle of the night I feel a heavy weight on me and wake up momentarily. Thinking my brother had gotten scared and wanted to sleep with me, I went back to sleep and woke up a few seconds later. Fully alert. Sat up. And screamed because there was a fully grown man on top of me. Immediately he got off of me and ran away. I went down to the bottom bunk where my dad was sleeping. He is a heavy sleeper. Told him what happened. And slept with him for the rest of the night. My grandfather passed away in 08. He was a big fan of opera music and would blare it in the morning if they ever had any grandkids sleeping over. About a week or two after his funeral, I was lying on my bed when I began to hear a scraping sound. I looked at the direction the sound came from to see a clock radio on the top shelf of my desk turn toward me, sliding across the desk to face me, and it started playing all by itself. The music it was playing was opera music. In high school, some girls I knew were in an awful car accident and one of them was killed. On the day of her funeral, her parents invited a bunch of us over to their house, which seemed awkward. But a few of us went. She was an only child and she was absolutely everything to them. We felt so badly for them. When I arrived, her parents told me I could visit her bedroom to say goodbye. On my way to her room I passed a friend in the hall who was making a beeline out of there, white as a sheet. I should have realized something was wrong. Her parents had her dead body laying on her bed. This is a comment I submitted to a thread a few months ago. When this happened, I was 15. My grandmother and I were both into the paranormal and would often go ghost hunting, either in areas that the locals would claim were haunted to nationally recognized landmarks. Armed with only a Polaroid camera, amateurs after all. One day we went into a very old graveyard dating to the 1700s. This was in her own neighborhood, which had several gated areas devoted to the original families who had settled into the region. We approached one of these gated areas, and I had to literally wrench open this wrought iron gate to get into the family plot. Not only was it rusted, the hinges squeaked angrily, but there were also many weeds growing into it. It was a great deal of effort just to move. We toured around the family plot as I snapped a few pictures on the Polaroid camera for about a half an hour. When we noticed storm clouds were moving in, Grandma said it was time to pack it in before it hit. I agreed. As we finished up and turned to that wrought iron gate again, we noticed that it was no longer open, but had closed to its original position. We stood for a moment registering this, and before we could comment on it, the gate, which was a BTCH to open in the first place, soundlessly opened up, allowing passage. We wordlessly walked to the car and started driving home. Once we were free and clear of the graveyard, we started talking about what had just happened. We couldn't decide if the gate opening was a friendly "have a nice day" or GTFO. My mom was at a tailgate party when she was in her early teens. She said this weird guy showed up, drank with her and her friends, and gave her and her friend a ride home. They both realized that he wasn't driving them to where they had both asked to be driven to. He was asking them a lot of inappropriate questions and my mom got sketched out. He made some kind of comment about my mom being too tall for him to take. She had no idea what that meant, but she had a signal with her friend when something weird was happening and my mom gave it. Both my mom and her friend requested to be let the FCK out of his car. He wouldn't let them out, but he did slow down. So both of them jumped out of the car and ran. Years and years later, she was watching the news and recognized the guy who gave her a ride as Clifford Elson, a F-King serial killer. Her friend called her and said, "That's the F-King weird guy who tried to drive us home that one night." Double quote. I laid in bed and listened as someone tried to break into my apartment. This was before cell phones, and I didn't have a landline. It was a 3-month sublet before I left for college. The roommate I was supposed to live with moved out 3 days after I moved in because someone had broken in and tried to RP her. Forgot why he didn't succeed. Maybe she screamed and he noped out. In the morning I found several screens slit. Of course I had locked all the windows before bed. I've never been so terrified. Another creepy thing. I was hitchhiking in the 70s and this guy passed the intersection that was my destination. I look over at the guy and state the obvious. Apparently this little troll didn't want to let me out of his car. So I told him I'd grab the wheel and slam his car into the next telephone pole if he didn't stop. He did.